Right now, as you read these words, you're the last of your kind, and you don't even know it. Every single human being alive today belongs to one species, and one species only, Homo sapiens. And there is nothing else even remotely like us left on this planet. That fact, the fact that we are utterly alone as a species of intelligent beings on Earth, is one of the most extraordinary and underappreciated mysteries in all of science. Think about it for a moment. Look at virtually any other category of life on this planet, and you will find a riot of diversity. Ants come in more than 10,000 known species. The cat family alone boasts around 40 distinct species, from lions and tigers to leopards and domestic house cats, dogs. If you count all the breeds humans have engineered plus their wild relatives like wolves and coyotes, present hundreds of varieties. Whales split into dozens of species. Bears come in 8. Even our closest living relatives, the great apes, include chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas, and orangutans as separate species. Yet, when it comes to human beings, there is exactly one species, just us, alone. That should strike you as deeply, profoundly strange, because from a biological standpoint, it is, in the natural world, when a successful group of organisms spreads across different environments and continents. It almost always diversifies into multiple species over time. Geographic isolation, different selection pressures, genetic drift, these forces conspire to split single lineages into many. It happened with finches on the Galapagos Islands. It happened with cichlid fish in the African Great Lakes. It happened with elephants, with horses, with virtually every large mammal family you can name. But it did not happen with us. Or rather, it did happen with us, and then something went terribly, catastrophically wrong for every human species that was not Homo sapiens. Because here is the fact that changes everything once you truly grasp it. We were not always alone. Not even close. The Earth was once home to a startling variety of human species. Multiple kinds of people walking the planet at the same time, living in different regions, adapting to different climates, developing their own tools and cultures and ways of being in the world. And then, one by one, they all vanished, every single one of them, until only we remained. The question of why that happened, why we are the sole survivors of what was once a diverse family of human species, is one of the most important and haunting questions in all of human evolution. It touches on everything from climate science to warfare, from genetics to sheer dumb luck. And the answer, as we will see, is far more complex and far more unsettling than most people realize. Let us begin with the astonishing fact of human diversity itself. Because before you can understand why we are alone, you need to understand just how crowded the human family tree once was. The story of human evolution is not a straight line from ape to modern person, no matter what those famous diagrams in textbooks might suggest. It is more like a bush, a wildly branching shrub with dozens of twigs shooting off in different directions, most of them ending abruptly in extinction over the past 7 million years. Since our lineage first split from the ancestors we share with chimpanzees, an extraordinary parade of human and near-human species has come and gone. Some lasted millions of years. Some lasted only a few 100,000. Some we know from rich fossil records spanning multiple continents, while others are known from nothing more than a single jawbone or a few fragments of DNA extracted from cave dirt. But what recent research has made stunningly clear is that for most of human evolutionary history, having multiple human species alive at the same time was the norm, not the exception. It is our current situation, with just one species. That is the anomaly. Consider what the world looked like roughly 300,000 years ago. According to recent estimates from paleoanthropologists working across Africa, Europe, and Asia, at least 9 distinct species of the genus Homo were alive on Earth at that time. 9 different kinds of people, each with their own anatomy, their own adaptations, their own way of making a living in the world. That number is remarkable enough on its own. But what makes it even more striking is that 300,000 years ago is not ancient history in evolutionary terms. It is practically yesterday. The dinosaurs went extinct 66 million years ago. The first mammals appeared over 200 million years ago. 300,000 years is a blink, a fraction of percent of the history of life on Earth. And yet in that geological instant, we went from 9 human species to 1. So, who were these other humans? Let us put names and faces to them, because they deserve to be remembered. They were, after all, our closest relatives, and in some cases, our direct ancestors. The most famous of the lost humans is undoubtedly the Neanderthal, Homo neanderthalensis. The Neanderthals were our closest known relatives, and they were formidable beings. They lived across Europe and Western Asia for several 100,000 years, thriving in some of the harshest Ice Age environments the continent had to offer. Physically, they were built like tanks. Neanderthals had robust, muscular bodies with barrel chests and thick limbs, perfectly adapted to conserve heat in frigid climates. Their skulls housed brains that were, on average, actually slightly larger than those of modern humans, though shaped somewhat differently, with a longer, lower profile and prominent brow ridges. They were skill hunters who took down large and dangerous prey, including woolly mammoths, bison, and wild horses, using sophisticated stone-tipped spears. They controlled fire, built shelters, and there is growing evidence that they engaged in symbolic behavior. Things like burying their dead, using pigments for body decoration, and even creating simple art. For a long time, Neanderthals were dismissed as brutish, dim-witted cavemen, a stereotype that says more about our own prejudices than about the Neanderthals themselves. Modern research has thoroughly demolished that image. Neanderthals were intelligent, resourceful, and culturally complex beings who successfully occupied some of the most challenging environments on Earth for far longer than modern civilization has existed. Then there are the Denisovans, Homo denisova, perhaps the most mysterious members of the human family. The Denisovans are remarkable because we know they existed primarily through genetics rather than fossils. Their discovery came in 2010, when scientists extracted DNA from a tiny finger bone found in Denisova cave in the mountains of southern Siberia. The genetic analysis revealed a population of humans distinct from both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, a previously unknown branch of the human family tree. Since then, only a handful of Denisovan fossils have been identified, including a jawbone found in a cave on the Tibetan Plateau at an elevation of over 10,000 feet. That high-altitude find is significant because it suggests the Denisovans were adapted to life in thin mountain air, a trait they may have passed on to modern Tibetan populations through interbreeding. The Denisovans appear to have ranged across a vast swath of Asia, from Siberia to Southeast Asia, and their genetic legacy lives on in modern human populations across the region. Homo erectus is another giant of the human story, though giant is perhaps the wrong word for a species that varied considerably in size across its enormous range. Homo erectus first appeared in Africa roughly 2 million years ago and was the first human species to expand beyond the African continent, eventually spreading across much of Asia. They were the cosmopolitans of the ancient human world, and their success was extraordinary by any measure. Homo erectus populations persisted in parts of Southeast Asia until perhaps as recently as 100,000 years ago, making them one of the longest-lived human species in the fossil record. They made sophisticated stone tools, controlled fire, and may have been the first humans to cook their food regularly, a behavioral innovation with profound implications for brain development and social life. Homo heidelbergensis, sometimes called Heidelberg man, was a large-brained human species that lived in Europe and Africa from roughly 700,000 to 200,000 years ago. Many researchers consider them the common ancestor of both Neanderthals and modern humans, the population from which both lineages diverged. They were tall, powerfully built, and skilled hunters who worked together to bring down large game. Evidence from sites in Germany and elsewhere suggests they may have constructed simple shelters and used wooden spears with remarkable sophistication. Then there are the island humans, species that evolve in isolation on remote islands and develop in startling and unexpected ways. Homo floresiensis, discovered in a cave on the island of Flores in Indonesia, is perhaps the most famous of these. Standing only about 3.5 feet tall, with a brain roughly the size of a chimpanzee's, Homo floresiensis was quickly nicknamed the Hobbit by the media. Despite their small size and small brains, these diminutive humans made stone tools and apparently hunted small elephants called stegodons that shared their island home. Their small stature is believed to be an example of island dwarfism, the well-documented tendency for large animals isolated on islands to evolve smaller body sizes over time in response to limited resources. Similarly, Homo luzonensis was discovered in a cave on the island of Luzon in the Philippines, and like Homo floresiensis, they were small in stature and exhibited a mosaic of primitive and modern features that has puzzled researchers. Their curved toe bones suggest they may have been adept climbers, hinting at a lifestyle quite different from that of their mainland relatives. In southern Africa, the discovery of Homo naledi sent shockwaves through the paleoanthropological community, found deep in the Rising Star cave system near Johannesburg. Homo naledi had a surprisingly small brain, roughly a third the size of a modern human's. Yet their bones were found in a context that strongly suggests intentional burial of the dead, a behavior previously thought to require a much larger brain. Even more surprising was the dating of the fossils, which revealed that Homo naledi lived as recently as roughly 300,000 years ago, meaning they were contemporaries of early Homo sapiens in Africa. The implication is staggering. While our ancestors were evolving the large brains and complex behaviors that would eventually take them to the moon, another human species with a brain barely larger than a gorilla's was living just a few hundred miles away. And then there is the newest addition to the human family tree, a discovery so recent that its implications are still being debated. In 2024, a team of researchers from the United States and China published a groundbreaking paper in the journal Nature, describing a new human species they named Homo juluensis. The name, derived from a Chinese term meaning people with big heads, refers to the species' most striking feature, a cranial capacity that exceeded the average for both Homo sapiens and Neanderthals. Homo juluensis appears to have lived in East Asia from roughly 300,000 to 50,000 years ago, overlapping in both time and geography with several other human species. Evidence from their archaeological sites suggests they made stone tools, hunted animals, and processed animal hides to make clothing or blankets for warmth. Perhaps most intriguingly, researchers have suggested that Homo juluensis may be closely related to, or even synonymous with, the Denisovans. If that connection holds up, it would mean the mysterious Denisovans, previously known almost entirely from DNA, finally have a face and a body, and that face belonged to a big-headed human species that was one of our closest relatives. These are just the species we know about, the ones that left behind enough bones, teeth, or DNA for us to identify them. The actual number of human species that lived and died over the past several million years was almost certainly much higher. Every few years, a new discovery in a cave or a riverbed or a genomic database reveals another branch of the human family tree we never knew existed. The picture that emerges from all of this is one of extraordinary diversity. For most of the time that humans have existed, Earth was a planet of many peoples, not one. Different human species occupied different ecological niches across Africa, Europe, and Asia. Some were adapted to freezing tundra. Others thrived in tropical forests. Some lived at high altitudes. Others on remote islands. Some had enormous brains. Others got by with surprisingly small ones. It was, in a real sense, a golden age of human diversity, a time when the human experiment was being run in parallel across the globe, with different species finding different solutions to the challenges of survival. And then it all came crashing down, starting roughly 100,000 years ago and accelerating dramatically between 70,000 and 40,000 years ago. Species after species began to disappear. The great extinction of the humans had begun, and by the time it was over, only one species would be left standing. By approximately 40,000 years ago, the last Neanderthal had drawn their final breath in a cave somewhere in southern Europe, perhaps in what is now Spain or Gibraltar. The Denisovans had faded from the mountains and forests of Asia. Homo erectus, that most enduring of human species, had finally succumbed after nearly 2 million years. The hobbits of Flores, the small humans of Luzon, homonality in Africa, all gone. The planet that had once teemed with human diversity was suddenly, startlingly empty of all but one kind of person. So what happened? Why did every other human species go extinct while Homo sapiens not only survived but went on to dominate the entire planet? This is a central mystery, the question that had consumed researchers for decades. And the honest answer is that we still do not know for certain. What we do have is a set of compelling hypotheses, each supported by different lines of evidence, and the growing consensus that the truth probably involves some combination of all of them. The first and perhaps most intuitive hypothesis is climate change. The period during which other human species went extinct was also a period of dramatic and often violent climate fluctuations. The Pleistocene epoch, which lasted from roughly 2.5 million years ago to about 12,000 years ago, was characterized by repeated cycles of glaciation, periods when massive ice sheets advance across the northern hemisphere, dramatically altering landscapes, ecosystems, and the availability of food and water. These ice ages were not gentle affairs. They transformed forests into tundra, lowered sea levels by hundreds of feet, and created vast deserts where there had previously been grasslands. For species that were adapted to specific environments, these changes could be catastrophic. A study published in the journal Nature used paleoclimate reconstructions and ecosystem models to demonstrate that several human species, including Neanderthals, Homo erectus, and Homo heidelbergensis, experienced significant loss of suitable habitat in the periods immediately preceding their extinction. The researchers found that these species lost a majority of their climatically suitable range before they disappeared from the fossil record, suggesting that environmental deterioration played a major role in their demise. For the Neanderthals specifically, the final phase of their existence coincided with a period of particularly harsh and unstable climate in Europe. As the last ice age tightened its grip, the forests and grasslands where Neanderthals hunted shrank dramatically, fragmenting their populations into small, isolated groups clinging to refugia along the Mediterranean coast. Small, isolated populations are vulnerable to a host of problems, from inbreeding to random catastrophes. And it may be that climate change did not kill the Neanderthals directly so much as it weakened them to the point where other pressures could finish the job. The second major hypothesis centers on competition for resources. Beginning roughly 70,000 years ago, Homo sapiens began expanding out of Africa in significant numbers, pushing into the Middle East, then into Europe and Asia. Everywhere they went, they encountered other human species that had been living in those regions for hundreds of thousands of years. And everywhere they went, those other species eventually disappeared. The correlation between Homo sapiens' arrival and the extinction of other human species is difficult to dismiss as coincidence. A team of researchers led by Professor Axel Timmerman at the Climate Physics Center at the University of Hawaii developed a sophisticated numerical model that combined data on Homo sapiens migration patterns, climate conditions, and food resource availability to test different scenarios for Neanderthal extinction. Their results were striking. The model found that neither interbreeding alone nor catastrophic volcanic eruptions could adequately explain the pattern of Neanderthal disappearance. Instead, the scenario that best matched the archaeological and genetic evidence was competitive exclusion, the process by which one species outcompetes another for the same resources until the weaker competitor can no longer sustain itself. In ecological terms, competitive exclusion is a well-established phenomenon when two species occupy the same ecological niche. The one with even a slight advantage in efficiency or adaptability will gradually push the other toward extinction. It does not require violence or malice, just a persistent, grinding edge in the competition for food, shelter, and territory. If Homo sapiens was even marginally better at hunting, gathering, or exploiting a wider range of food sources, that small advantage, compounded over thousands of years, could have been enough to tip the balance against every other human species they encountered. The third hypothesis is darker and more disturbing, and it involves direct violence. Some researchers have proposed that Homo sapiens did not merely outcompete other human species, but actively killed them. This is the warfare hypothesis, and while it is difficult to prove from the archaeological record, it is not as far-fetched as it might initially sound. Consider our track record. The history of Homo sapiens is saturated with violence, not just against other species, but against our own kind. Warfare, genocide, ethnic cleansing, these are recurring themes in human history that stretch back to the earliest civilizations and almost certainly predate them. If we have proven ourselves willing to slaughter members of our own species over differences in religion, ethnicity, or ideology, it is not difficult to imagine that our ancestors might have been even more hostile toward beings who looked and behaved differently enough to be perceived as fundamentally other. The evidence of this hypothesis is mostly circumstantial. There are no mass graves of slaughtered Neanderthals, no cave paintings depicting interspecies warfare. But the absence of direct evidence does not mean it did not happen. And some anthropologists have argued that organized violence by Homo sapiens groups against smaller, more isolated populations of other human species could have been a significant factor in their extinction. The fourth hypothesis involves disease, and it draws on a chilling parallel from more recent history. When European explorers and colonists arrived in the Americas beginning in the late 15th century, they brought with them diseases to which the indigenous populations had no immunity. The result was catastrophic. Smallpox, measles, influenza, and other European diseases swept through native populations, killing an estimated 90% or more of the indigenous people of the Americas within a few generations. The epidemiological disaster that accompanied European colonization of the New World provides a sobering model for what might have happened when Homo sapiens first encountered other human species. As Homo sapiens groups spread out of Africa and into new territories, they would have carried with them a suite of pathogens and parasites to which they had evolved at least partial resistance. The human species they encountered, species that have been evolving in isolation for hundreds of thousands of years, would have had no such resistance. A novel disease introduced into a small, genetically homogeneous population can be devastating. And the evidence suggests that most other human species existed in relatively small groups with limited genetic diversity. Genetic analysis of Neanderthal remains has revealed that their populations were indeed small and relatively inbred, with low levels of genetic diversity compared to contemporary Homo sapiens populations. This would have made them particularly vulnerable to infectious diseases, as a population with limited genetic variation has fewer immunological tools to fight off novel pathogens. Conversely, Homo sapiens, with their larger population sizes and greater genetic diversity, would have been better equipped to weather epidemic diseases, with enough survivors in any given outbreak to maintain viable population numbers. The fifth hypothesis is perhaps the most fascinating and, in many ways, the most hopeful. It suggests that at least some of the other human species did not go truly extinct at all, but were instead absorbed into the Homo sapiens gene pool through interbreeding. The evidence for this hypothesis is not circumstantial or speculative. It is written directly into the DNA of every living person of non-African descent, beginning in 2010. Breakthroughs in ancient DNA technology allowed researchers to sequence the genomes of Neanderthals and Denisovans and compare them to the genomes of modern humans. The results were revolutionary. Modern humans of European, Asian, and other non-African ancestries carry approximately 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA in their genomes. This might sound like a small amount, but spread across billions of people, it represents a substantial portion of the Neanderthal genome, living on in modern humanity. Some populations carry even more archaic DNA. Indigenous peoples of Melanesia and Australia carry between 2 and 6% Denisovan DNA, a legacy of ancient encounters between their ancestors and the mysterious Denisovans of Southeast Asia. When you add up all the fragments of Neanderthal DNA scattered across the genomes of modern humans worldwide, researchers estimate that roughly 40% of the total Neanderthal genome can be reconstructed from living people. That is an astonishing figure. It means that nearly half of the Neanderthal genetic heritage survives, not in bones or fossils, but in the cells of people walking around today. The Neanderthals are not entirely gone. They are, in a very real biological sense, inside us. The same is true of the Denisovans and potentially of other archaic human species whose genetic contributions we have not yet identified. Some geneticists have found evidence of DNA from unknown archaic populations, so-called ghost populations, in the genomes of certain modern African groups, suggesting that interbreeding between different human species was even more widespread and complex than the Neanderthal and Denisovan stories alone would indicate. This paints a picture of human extinction that is far more nuanced than simple die-off. Yes, the Neanderthals and Denisovans disappeared as distinct populations. Their cultures, their languages, their ways of life are gone forever, but their genes live on, woven into the fabric of modern humanity. In some sense, they did not die out so much as they were absorbed. Their small populations gradually merging into much larger Homo sapiens population through generation after generation of interbreeding until their distinct identity was diluted beyond recognition. The reality is that no single hypothesis can fully explain why Homo sapiens ended up alone. The extinction of other human species was almost certainly a complex, multi-causal process that played out differently in different times and places. In some cases, climate change may have been the primary driver. In others, competition or disease may have been more important. And everywhere, interbreeding likely played at least some role, blurring the boundaries between species even as one was replacing the other. What the evidence increasingly suggests is that Homo sapiens did not survive because of any single dramatic advantage, but rather because of the accumulation of many small ones. We were slightly better hunters, slightly more versatile foragers, slightly more effective at social cooperation, slightly more inventive with our technology. None of these advantages was overwhelming on its own, but together, compounded over thousands of years and multiplied across hundreds of generations, they added up to an insurmountable edge. Archaeological sites dating to around 35,000 years ago show that Homo sapiens had developed technologies that no other human species ever matched. They were making woven textiles and fishing nets, sewing fitted clothing with bone needles, creating elaborate art and personal ornaments, and trading materials over distances of hundreds of miles. Each of these innovations, seemingly small on its own, would have provided concrete survival advantages. Woven nets allowed for more efficient food gathering. Sewn clothing provided better protection against cold, reducing mortality during harsh winters. Art and ornaments served as social bonding tools, strengthening the group cohesion that was essential for survival. And long-distance trade networks meant that if resources failed in one area, connections to distant groups could provide a lifeline. But the deepest and most fundamental advantage that Homo sapiens possessed, the one that made all the others possible, was our extraordinary capacity for large-scale cooperation among unrelated individuals. This is the argument most powerfully made by historians and anthropologists who study the cognitive revolution, the dramatic leap in human thinking and communication that occurred roughly 70,000 years ago. Before this revolution, Homo sapiens were anatomically modern, but behaviorally unremarkable, making the same basic stone tools that other human species made, living in the same small bands, occupying the same ecological niche. After the revolution, everything changed. What happened? according to researchers, was the development of a new kind of language, a language capable of doing something that no other communication system in the natural world had ever done, describing things that do not exist. Every animal communication system can convey information about the real world. A monkey can shriek to warn about a predator. A bee can dance to indicate the location of flowers. Even other human species could presumably communicate about immediate, concrete realities, the location of food, the presence of danger, the identity of group members. But Homo sapiens developed the ability to talk about things that exist only in the collective: imagination, gods, spirits, nations, laws, money, human rights, corporate brands. These are all fictions, things that have no physical reality outside of the stories humans tell about them. And yet they are arguably the most powerful forces in the world, because they enable millions of strangers to cooperate toward common goals. Consider how remarkable this is. You cannot convince a chimpanzee to give up a banana today by promising that after death, there will be unlimited bananas in chimpanzee heaven. The very idea is absurd when applied to any other species. But humans do this kind of thing all the time. We sacrifice present comfort for future rewards that exist only in our shared imagination. We obey laws written by people we have never met. We accept pieces of paper or numbers on a screen as valuable because everyone around us agrees they are valuable. We fight and die for nations, which are themselves elaborate fictions, lines on a map backed by shared stories about history and identity. This capacity for shared fiction is the secret weapon of Homo sapiens. It is what allowed us to break through the ceiling that limits cooperation in every other social species. In the animal kingdom, there are two basic models for large-scale cooperation. The first is the insect model, seen in ants, bees, and termites, where millions of individuals cooperate with extraordinary efficiency, but only because they are genetically related and their behavior is rigidly programmed by instinct. An ant colony can build remarkable structures and wage wars against rival colonies. But every ant in the colony is following a fixed genetic script. There is no flexibility, no innovation, no ability to adapt cooperative strategies to new challenges on the fly. The second model is the primate model, seen in chimpanzees, baboons, and other social mammals, where cooperation is flexible and intelligent but limited in scale. A chimpanzee can form political alliance with another chimpanzee, engage in strategic deception, and adjust its behavior based on complex social calculations. But chimpanzee cooperation is limited to individuals who know each other personally, typically groups of no more than a few dozen. Beyond that number, chimpanzee societies break down into factional conflict. Homo sapiens shattered both of these limits. We cooperate in groups of millions, even billions, with a flexibility and adaptability that no insect colony can match. We can reorganize our cooperative structures on the fly, inventing new institutions, new laws, new religions, new economic systems as circumstances demand. This is what makes human cooperation unique in the natural world. Not its scale alone, and not its flexibility alone, but the combination of massive scale with extreme flexibility. The mechanism that makes this possible is a shared fiction. The British anthropologist Robin Dunbar proposed that there is a natural limit to the number of stable relationships any individual primate can maintain, a limit determined by the size of the neocortex. For humans, Dunbar calculated this number at roughly 150. This means that any given person can maintain meaningful personal relationships with about 150 other people. Beyond that number, we simply cannot keep track of everyone, who they are, whether they can be trusted, what their relationship is to us. 150 is indeed a number that shows up repeatedly in human social organization. It is roughly the size of a typical hunter-gatherer band. It is the size of a basic military company in armies from ancient Rome to the modern United States. Military, it is the average size of a personal social network. Below 150, Human groups can function on the basis of personal knowledge and direct relationships. Everyone knows everyone else, and social cohesion is maintained through gossip, mutual obligation, and face-to-face interaction. But what happens when groups need to be larger than 150? This is where shared fictions become essential. To organize a city of thousands, an army of tens of thousands, or a nation of millions, you need something beyond personal relationships. You need shared stories, abstract concepts that everyone in the group accepts as real and binding even though they exist only in the collective imagination. Laws, constitutions, religious doctrines, national myths, currency systems, corporate charters. These are all technologies for scaling human cooperation beyond the Dunbar number. They allow strangers who have never met and never will meet to cooperate effectively because they share a common framework of beliefs and expectations. Two complete strangers who are both Catholics can cooperate on a charitable project because they share belief in the same God, the same moral framework, the same institutional authority. Two lawyers who have never met can collaborate on a complex legal case because they share belief in the law, in the concept of justice, in the binding nature of contracts and professional obligations. Two soldiers from different states can fight side by side because they share belief in the same nation, the same flag, the same ideals of duty and sacrifice. None of these things, not God, not the law, not the nation, exist in any physical sense. You cannot touch them or see them under a microscope. They are stories, and their power comes entirely from the fact that large numbers of people believe in them simultaneously. This is what Neanderthals and Denisovans and every other human species apparently could not do, or at least could not do at the same scale. They had intelligence, they had tools, they had culture of a sort, but they seemingly lacked the ability to construct and share the elaborate fictions necessary to organize cooperation among thousands or millions of unrelated individuals. A Neanderthal band of 30 or 40 could probably cooperate as effectively as a Homo sapiens band, of the same size. But Homo sapiens could network hundreds of bands together through shared myths, trade relationships, and cultural practices, creating a social organism of thousands where the Neanderthals were limited to dozens. In any competition between a network of thousands and a band of dozens, the outcome is inevitable, no matter how strong or smart or brave the members of the smaller group might be. This, more than any advantage in raw intelligence or physical strength, is likely the decisive factor that made Homo sapiens the last human standing. We did not win because we were the smartest. We did not win because we were the strongest. We won because we could cooperate in larger numbers and with greater flexibility than any other human species. And the tool that made that cooperation possible was our unique ability to create and believe in shared fictions. Of course, it would be a mistake to dismiss the other human species as cognitively primitive. Recent research has increasingly challenged the old assumption that Homo sapiens had a monopoly on symbolic thought and complex culture. Neanderthals, we now know, used fire in sophisticated ways, created pigments and ornaments, and may have engaged in ritual burial of their dead. There's even evidence that they created cave art, though this remains debated. Homo naledi, with its small brain, apparently disposed of its dead in deep cave chambers in what some researchers interpret as intentional mortuary behavior. If these interpretations are correct, then the cognitive gap between Homo sapiens and other human species may have been narrower than we long assumed. The difference may have been less about raw brain power and more about the specific type of cognition that enables the creation and sharing of complex fictions. Or it may have been partly about luck, about being in the right place at the right time with the right combination of abilities when the climate shifted, or a new disease appeared, or a critical technological innovation was made. The definitive moment when Homo sapiens became the sole human species is impossible to pinpoint with precision, but the evidence points to a period roughly 40,000 years ago as the critical threshold. By that time, the last known populations of Neanderthals had disappeared from their final refugia in southern Europe. The Denisovans had faded from the archaeological and genetic record. Homo erectus which had survived for nearly 2 million years across a vast range, was gone. The small island-dwelling species, Homo floresiensis and Homo luzonensis, had vanished from their respective island homes, with current evidence suggesting their extinction around 50,000 years ago, though earlier dates have been proposed. Homo naledi had disappeared from southern Africa. The newly described Homo giluensis, if it is indeed a distinct species, was gone from East Asia. By 40,000 years ago, if you could have surveyed the entire planet, you would have found only one kind of human being anywhere. The process by which this happened was not a single event, but a drawn-out series of regional extinction spanning tens of thousands of years. The out-of-Africa expansion of Homo sapiens, which began in earnest between 80,000 and 60,000 years ago, was a catalyst. As Homo sapiens groups pushed into the Middle East, then into Europe, then across Asia, and eventually into Australia and the Americas, they encountered and replaced every other human population they met. The pattern is consistent and striking. Homo sapiens arrives in a new region, and within a few thousand years, sometimes less, the resident human species disappears. In Europe, the overlap between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals lasted perhaps 5 to 10,000 years before the Neanderthals were gone. In Southeast Asia, the overlap with Homo erectus and the island species may have been even shorter. As Chris Stringer of the Natural History Museum in London has observed, the correlation between Homo sapiens expansion and the disappearance of other human species is too consistent to be coincidental. Whether the mechanism was competition, disease, violence, interbreeding, climate change, or some combination of all five, the arrival of Homo sapiens was effectively a death sentence for every other human species on the planet. This is both a triumph and a tragedy. A triumph because it represents the success of our lineage, the culmination of millions of years of evolution that produce a species capable of reshaping the world. A tragedy because it means we will never know what those other human species might have become. What would Neanderthal civilization look like after another 100,000 years of development? What philosophical traditions might the Denisovans have created? What art might Homo naledi have produced as their cultures evolved? We will never know, because they are gone, and we are the ones who, directly or indirectly, cause their disappearance. There is a question that naturally follows from all of this. If human evolution has produced multiple species in the past, why is it not doing so now? Why is there no sign of a new human species emerging anywhere on Earth? The answer to this question illuminates something profound about the relationship between biological evolution and cultural evolution, and about the way our own success has, paradoxically, frozen our species in place. For a new species to rise, you need reproductive isolation. You need a population of organisms to be separated from a main group for a long enough time that genetic differences accumulate to the point where interbreeding is no longer possible or no longer produces viable offspring. In the past, this happened naturally among human populations. Neanderthals evolved in the relative isolation of Ice Age Europe over hundreds of thousands of years. Denisovans evolved separately in Asia. Homo floresiensis evolved on an island cut off from the mainland. In each case, geographic barriers, oceans, mountain ranges, deserts, ice sheets, kept populations apart long enough for significant genetic divergence to occur. In the modern world, those barriers have effectively ceased to exist. A person born in New York can fly to Tokyo in 14 hours. Someone in rural Montana can video call someone in Sao Paulo in real time. The genetic isolation that was once an unavoidable fact of human existence has been completely eliminated by technology. Modern humans are not splitting into separate populations. They are merging into one. Global migration, international travel, and the interconnectedness of modern life mean that genes are flowing between human populations at an unprecedented rate. The genetic differences between human populations, which were already relatively small compared to those in many other species, are getting smaller with every generation. Studies of modern human genomes have shown that the genetic variation between continental populations is declining, while the genetic diversity within individuals is increasing. Exactly what you would expect in a species that is becoming one large, thoroughly mixed breeding population. This genetic homogenization makes the emergence of a new human species through natural processes essentially impossible under current conditions. Speciation requires tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of years of isolation, and there is nowhere on Earth where a human population could remain isolated for that long in a world of airplanes, ships, and the internet. There is another, deeper reason why new human species are unlikely to emerge under current conditions, and it has to do with the relationship between cultural and biological evolution. For most of the history of life, organisms adapted to their environments through biological evolution, the slow process of random genetic mutation, and natural selection. An animal that needed to survive in a cold climate had to evolve thicker fur or a layer of fat over many generations. A species that needed to exploit a new food source had to evolve new teeth or digestive enzymes over thousands of years. But Homo sapiens broke free from this constraint. We adapt to new environments not by changing our bodies, but by changing our technology. We do not need to evolve fur to survive in the Arctic because we can make parkas. We do not need to evolve gills to cross oceans because we can build boats. We do not need to evolve resistance to every disease because we can develop vaccines and antibiotics. Cultural evolution has largely replaced biological evolution as the primary mechanism by which humans adapt to their environment, and cultural evolution operates on a timescale of years or decades rather than millennia. The prominent paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould articulated this point forcefully when he argued that human beings have not undergone significant biological change in the past 40 to 50,000 years. The people who painted the caves at Lascaux, who carved the Venus figurines, who crossed the land bridge to the Americas, were biologically identical to people alive today. Everything that separates us from them, our cities, our technologies, our institutions, our accumulated knowledge, is a product of cultural rather than biological evolution. This is not to say that human biological evolution has completely stopped. There is evidence of ongoing microevolutionary changes in human populations, shifts in the frequency of certain gene variants related to diet, disease resistance, and other traits. Lactose tolerance in adults, for example, evolved independently in several pastoral populations within the last 10,000 years. High-altitude adaptations in Tibetan, Andean, and Ethiopian populations represent relatively recent evolutionary changes. Resistance to certain infectious diseases has evolved in populations with long exposure to those diseases. But these are minor tweaks, adjustments within a single species, not the kind of major divergence that leads to the creation of new species. The fundamental architecture of the human body and brain has remained essentially unchanged for tens of thousands of years, and the selective pressures that might drive more dramatic change have been largely neutralized by our cultural and technological buffers. Modern medicine alone has profoundly altered the landscape of natural selection. In the past, individuals with genetic predispositions to certain diseases or physical limitations would have been less likely to survive and reproduce, creating selection pressure that shaped the gene pool over time. Today, medical intervention allows the vast majority of people to survive to reproductive age regardless of their genetic endowment, dramatically reducing the intensity of natural selection. Social welfare systems, modern agriculture, and global trade further buffer human populations from the environmental pressures that drive evolutionary change. So is humanity destined to remain a single species forever? Almost certainly, as long as we remain confined to a single planet with modern transportation and communication technology. But there is one scenario that could change this, and it involves leaving Earth. If humanity establishes permanent colonies on other planets, particularly planets in other solar systems, where travel times will be measured in years or decades rather than hours, the conditions for speciation could theoretically be reestablished. A colonie on Mars, separated from Earth by months of travel time and subject to radically different environmental conditions, including different gravity, different radiation levels, different atmospheric composition, would experience selective pressures very different from those on Earth. Over thousands of generations, a Martian human population might begin to diverge genetically from its terrestrial cousins. If the colonies were distant enough and isolated enough, and if enough time passed, those divergences could eventually accumulate to the point where the two populations could no longer interbreed successfully, at which point, by the standard biological definition, they would be separate species. NASA scientist Rav Sharf has speculated that if humanity spreads to multiple star systems, the environmental differences between those systems would be so extreme that evolutionary divergence would be inevitable. Humans living in different gravity wells, breathing different atmospheres, exposed to different radiation environments, eating different foods, would be subject to wildly different selection pressures. Over time, these pressures would mold different populations in different directions, potentially producing multiple new human species adapted to their respective worlds. Of course, by the time this happens, if it ever does, humanity may have taken evolution into its own hands through genetic engineering, a possibility that opens up an entirely different set of questions and scenarios. If we can edit our own genome, the distinction between natural and artificial speciation becomes blurred. We might create new human variants not through the slow grinding of natural selection, but through deliberate design, raising profound ethical and philosophical questions about what it means to be human. But all of that lies in the speculative future. For now, and for foreseeable future, we are alone. One species, one kind of human, on one small planet. And that raises perhaps the most thought-provoking question of all. What would the world look like if we were not alone? What if another human species had survived alongside us into the modern era? This thought experiment is not merely idle fantasy. It forces us to confront fundamental questions about identity, empathy, rights, and the boundaries of moral community. Imagine, for a moment, that the Neanderthals had not gone extinct. Imagine that instead of disappearing 40,000 years ago, a population of Neanderthals had persisted in some corner of Europe, maintaining their own culture and way of life through the millennia. Imagine that as Homo sapiens civilization developed, as agriculture was invented, and cities were built, and empires rose and fell, the Neanderthals were there too, a separate human society developing in parallel. What would the relationship between the two species look like? The optimistic version of this scenario imagines a world enriched by the presence of a second, intelligent species. Perhaps Homo sapiens and Neanderthals would have found ways to complement each other, trading goods and ideas, learning from each other's different perspectives and abilities. Neanderthals, with their superior cold weather adaptations and robust physiology, might have been invaluable partners in Arctic exploration or heavy physical labor. Their potentially different cognitive style, we know their brains were structured differently from ours, might have led to unique approaches to art, engineering, or problem-solving that enriched both cultures. A world with two human species might have been a world with twice the creativity, twice the innovation, twice the cultural richness. But the pessimistic version of the scenario is, unfortunately, far more plausible given what we know about human nature. Homo sapiens have a deeply ingrained tendency to divide the world into in-groups and out-groups, to define identity in terms of who we are not as much as who we are. We have waged wars over differences in religion, ethnicity, language, and skin color, differences that are, from a genetic standpoint, trivially small. If we are capable of such hostility toward members of our own species who differ from us only superficially, how much greater would our hostility be toward a genuinely different species of human? The history of Homo sapiens includes countless examples of one group dehumanizing another, treating fellow humans as subhuman in order to justify exploitation, enslavement, or extermination. if actual, biologically distinct human beings existed alongside us. The temptation to categorize them as lesser, as not fully human, as not deserving of the same rights and protections we extend to our own kind, would be overwhelming. It is grimly easy to imagine a world where Neanderthal populations were enslaved, segregated, subjected to medical experimentation, or targeted for extermination by Homo sapiens governments that viewed them as a threat or a resource rather than as equals. International law, human rights frameworks, the very concept of universal human dignity. All of these are built on the assumption that there is one human species with shared moral status. Introduce a second species into the equation, and the entire ethical framework becomes contested. Would Neanderthals have human rights? Would they be citizens? Could they vote, own property, marry Homo sapiens? These questions have no easy answers. And the fact that we struggle even to extend equal rights to all members of our own species suggests that the addition of a genuinely different human species would have created moral and political challenges of an almost unimaginable magnitude. The thought experiment also raises questions about identity and self-understanding. Much of human culture, philosophy, and religion is built on the assumption that we are unique, that there is something special and singular about the human condition. How would that self-understanding change if we shared the planet with another species that was also intelligent, also creative, also capable of love and grief and wonder? Would we feel diminished, threatened, humble? Would the existence of another human species force us to reevaluate our place in the cosmos, to question the narratives of specialness and chosenness that run through so many human cultures? Or would we simply absorb them into our existing frameworks, finding ways to maintain our sense of uniqueness, even in the face of evidence that we are not? In fact alone, these questions are ultimately unanswerable because the scenario they describe never came to pass. The Neanderthals are gone. The Denisovans are gone. Every other human species that ever lived is gone. We are, for better or worse, the only humans left, and we have been for 40,000 years. But the fact that we can ask these questions, the fact that we can imagine alternative histories and think about what they would mean for our self-understanding and our ethics, is itself a testament to the unique cognitive abilities that made Homo sapiens the last human standing. And so, we come to the final question, the question that underlies everything we have discussed. Is humanity special? It is tempting to answer with an unqualified yes. After all, we are the species that survived. We are the ones who conquered every continent, built civilizations, split the atom, walked on the moon, and are now reaching toward the stars. We outcompete every other human species, mastered every environment on Earth, and reshaped the planet in our image. Surely that makes us special, but the scientific evidence tells a more complicated story. 100,000 years ago, Homo sapiens was an unremarkable species of primate living in Africa, one of several human species, and by no means obviously destined for greatness. Our ancestors at that time had no agriculture, no cities, no written language. They lived in small bands, made simple stone tools, and occupied a limited geographic range. They were, by any objective measure, no more impressive than the Neanderthals who hunted mammoths in Europe or the Denisovans who thrived in the mountains of Asia. What changed was not our fundamental biology, but our culture. Somewhere around 70,000 years ago, something clicked, the cognitive revolution, the development of complex language and shared fiction, whatever you want to call it. And Homo sapiens began a trajectory of cultural evolution that accelerated exponentially and has not slowed down since. But here is the humbling part. That trajectory was not inevitable. If the climate had shifted differently, if a particular epidemic had struck at a particular time, if a crucial innovation had been made by Neanderthals instead of by Homo sapiens, the outcome might have been entirely different. Evolution is not a march of progress toward a predetermined goal. It is a messy, contingent, unpredictable process in which luck plays an enormous role. We are the survivors of that process, but we are not its culmination. We are the last branch on a once flourishing bush. The final twig still bearing leaves after all the others have been stripped bare. That does not make us the best branch or the most important branch. It makes us the luckiest. This realization should inspire both humility and responsibility. Humility because our position as the sole surviving human species is not a testament to our inherent superiority, but rather the result of a complex interplay of ability, circumstance, and chance. And responsibility because, as the last humans, we carry a burden that no other species bears. We are the custodians not only of our own future, but of the entire legacy of the human family, including the species we replaced, absorbed, or destroyed. If Homo sapiens fails, if we destroy ourselves through war, environmental catastrophe, or some other self-inflicted disaster, the story of the human lineage, all 7 million years of it, ends with us. There are no backup humans waiting in the wings. No second human species that could carry on the torch if we drop it. We are it, the last experiment, the final model. Everything rides on us. And perhaps that is the most important lesson to take from the story of why there is only one human species left on Earth. We are not special because we survived. We are special because we are alone, and because being alone means that the fate of everything that the word human has ever meant. Every tool, every painting, every song, every act of kindness and cruelty and wonder and despair that any member of the genus Homo has ever performed rests entirely on our shoulders. If you could somehow ask a Neanderthal what they thought of modern Homo sapiens, what would they say? Would they see us as the worthy inheritors of the human legacy, a species that earned its place through ingenuity and determination? Or would they see us as the lucky ones who happened to survive? Now, squandering our inheritance by poisoning our planet and threatening our own extinction? The answer probably depends on what we do next. We have the cognitive tools, the social structures, the technological capabilities to build a future worthy of the extraordinary journey that brought us here. But we also have the capacity for short-sightedness, selfishness, and self-destruction that could bring the entire human experiment to an ignominious end. The choice is ours. We are the last humans. What we do with that distinction, whether we treat it as a privilege to be honored or a fluke to be squandered, will determine not just our own fate, but the final chapter of a story that began 7 million years ago on the plains of Africa, when the first proto-human stood upright and looked out at a world full of possibility. We are alone now, but we carry within us, literally in our DNA, the echoes of all the humans who came before, the Neanderthal genes in our genome, the Denisovan adaptations in our blood, the unknown archaic lineages woven into our chromosomes. These are not just biological curiosities. They are reminders that we were once part of a larger family, a diverse community of human species sharing this planet, and that we bear the responsibility of being the last ones here to tell the story.